A modest craftsman working in the borough of Queens uncovered a secret that would ultimately dismantle one of the most intricate Soviet intelligence networks ever established on American territory. The smoking gun was not found in a safe, but concealed within the worn leather of high-end European footwear. What this artisan detected would completely upend the Federal Bureau of Investigation's understanding of foreign espionage tactics within New York. The evidence was hidden in plain view, etched into the soles of Italian shoes, waiting for a trained eye to decode the story they held. The autumn of 1957 arrived in New York City with a strange reluctance, bringing unseasonably high temperatures that kept the sidewalks of Queens teeming with life. Pedestrians delayed retrieving their heavy winter boots, persisting with lighter leather soles far later into the season than usual. Frank Martinez ran a modest cobbler's workshop situated on Roosevelt Avenue in Jackson Heights. The neighborhood itself was undergoing a profound metamorphosis, shifting from its pre-war roots into a vibrant, polyglot community where languages from across the globe filled the air. In this transforming district, junior diplomats and United Nations staff lived shoulder to shoulder with working-class immigrants. People from dozens of nations had flocked to this corner of post-war America, all searching for a fresh start and economic stability in a new world. Martinez had inherited his trade from his father in Puerto Rico, mastering the art of shoe repair before the family migrated to New York in 1946. Frank approached his work with a meticulous intensity that transcended mere repair, turning him into a student of human movement. He had spent years analyzing the biomechanics of how people walked. He understood how a person's unique gait carved a signature into leather, revealing not only the distance traveled but also the specific nature of the ground beneath their feet, whether pavement, carpet, or stone. His shop was strategically located just 3 blocks from a sprawling residential complex favored by the diplomatic corps. This proximity ensured a steady clientele of international officials who trusted Frank with their premium European footwear, demanding a level of skill unavailable elsewhere. Among these regulars was a man named Konstantin Fedoseev, whom Frank had been serving for roughly 8 months. He introduced himself as a cultural attaché for the Soviet mission to the UN, appearing like clockwork every 4 to 6 weeks to have his expensive Italian shoes restored. Fedoseev possessed a functional command of English, though thick with an accent. He settled every bill with cash, presenting crisp, uncirculated banknotes that looked as if they had just left the printing press. His attire was always impeccable, dark, tailored suits that signaled mid-level authority. The diplomat maintained a veil of professional detachment. He was polite but impenetrable, effectively shutting down any attempt at small talk that might stray beyond the immediate business of dropping off worn shoes or collecting the repaired pairs. It was during the 3rd or 4th transaction that Frank sensed an anomaly. The wear patterns eroding Fedoseev's shoes did not align with the narrative of his life. A cultural attaché's duties should have been sedentary: museum visits, embassy receptions, and meetings in carpeted offices. Such a job implies walking primarily on polished marble or the paved avenues of Manhattan, near the UN headquarters. Yet, the damage to Fedoseev's soles told a radically different story, one of grueling physical activity that contradicted his white-collar cover. The outer edges of the heels were ground down significantly, while the balls of the feet showed aggressive scuffing. To Frank's experienced eye, these were the scars of long-distance marches over rough, uneven terrain, gravel, industrial debris, and unpaved roads. Over his career, Frank had cultivated the habit of logging peculiar jobs in a leather-bound notebook kept beneath his counter. What started as a customer service tool had mutated into a forensic logbook, recording the degradation of materials with scientific precision. He began to profile Fedoseev's footwear with increasing scrutiny. He sketched the erosion patterns, used calipers to measure the thinning of the soles, and noted specific abrasions. The damage shifted between visits, suggesting the diplomat was altering his routes or the terrain he traversed. This inconsistency struck Frank as deeply suspicious. A bureaucrat with a fixed schedule of cultural events should generate consistent wear patterns. The fluctuating damage suggested a man whose daily movements were far more erratic and physically demanding than his job description allowed. By the time the sixth pair crossed his counter, Frank had gathered enough empirical data to identify a disturbing trend. Although he couldn't verbalize exactly what was happening, the forensic evidence in his journal pointed toward a deception that unsettled him to his core. Based on the rate of leather erosion, the diplomat was marching between 10 and 15 miles every single day. This was an athletic feat no office administrator would perform, and the chemical staining on the leather suggested repeated exposure to heavy industrial zones. Embedded within the rubber heels, Martinez discovered microscopic metallic debris. He carefully extracted these fragments, placing them in small envelopes, guided by an instinct that this industrial residue mattered, even if he couldn't yet grasp its geopolitical weight. He sensed that these mundane details about a diplomat's shoes might be a crucial puzzle piece in the escalating Cold War. However, the decision to alert the authorities was agonizing for Martinez, who still carried the psychological burden of the immigrant experience. Having lived in the U.S. for only 11 years, he wrestled with doubt for 3 weeks. He feared the FBI would brand him a paranoid fool or a conspiracy theorist for seeing espionage in the scuffed shoes of a cultural worker. The risk of humiliation loomed large. Worse, he feared that inviting federal scrutiny might backfire, marking him and his family as troublemakers. The shadow of McCarthyism still lingered, making many immigrant communities deeply cautious about voluntarily interacting with government law enforcement. It was his wife, Maria, who finally broke the deadlock. Late one night in their apartment, she argued that while a false alarm would cost nothing, silence in the face of a genuine threat could enable a dangerous enemy to operate with impunity on American soil. Bolstered by her resolve, Frank found the nerve to act. On a biting November morning in 1957, he dialed the New York field office. Special Agent Peter Morrison, a veteran of counterintelligence, took the call at the federal building on Foley Square. Morrison listened as the cobbler laid out his theory. While the premise of tracking spies through shoe wear seemed initially far-fetched, the technical specificity of Martinez's description, particularly the mention of metallic particles, cut through the agent's skepticism. Morrison instructed Martinez to bring his journal and the collected samples to the bureau immediately. Frank agreed to the meeting, but as he placed the receiver back in its cradle, his hands trembled. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Special Agent Peter Morrison laid the cobbler's journal open across the expanse of his desk at the Foley Square field office. He spent hours deciphering the intricate diagrams and columns of figures that Frank Martinez had meticulously recorded over 8 months of handling Konstantin Fedosiev's footwear. In his 6 years working counterintelligence, Morrison had built dossiers on numerous suspected Soviet operatives, yet he had never come across intelligence gathered with such unorthodox methodology. The initial doubt he felt began to evaporate as he absorbed the sheer technical rigor of Martinez's work. The journal contained not merely sketches of worn leather but precise calculations of degradation rates, tracked week by week. It was a level of analytical discipline one might expect from a forensic scientist in a crime lab, not a neighborhood craftsman working out of a shop in Queens. The small paper envelopes Martinez had provided became the focal point of the inquiry. Morrison examined the contents under high magnification, observing the metallic dust. The distinctive coloration suggested these were not random urban scraps, but shavings from a specialized industrial process. Recognizing the potential gravity of the find, he immediately dispatched the samples to the FBI's Technical Services Division. He requested a priority analysis to determine the exact elemental composition and, if possible, the industrial origin of the fragments extracted from the rubber heels. The laboratory returned its findings within 48 hours, and the results fundamentally altered the stakes of the investigation. What had been a curious tip from a civilian was instantly elevated to a matter of critical national security, transforming Morrison's interest into urgent alarm. The analysis revealed the particles were high-grade titanium alloy shavings, intermingled with trace amounts of specialized chromium steel. These materials were virtually non-existent in general manufacturing and were used almost exclusively within the aerospace and advanced weaponry sectors. Specifically, these alloys were the hallmarks of jet engine turbine production and the internal guidance systems of missiles. These represented the crown jewels of American defense technology, secrets that were guarded with extreme prejudice during the height of the Cold War. The timing could not have been more sensitive. The Soviet Union was aggressively trying to bridge the strategic gap in ballistic missile technology, having just shocked the world with the successful launch of Sputnik only a month earlier, in October of 1957. The FBI mapped the distribution of industrial facilities in the New York metropolitan area capable of working with these specific exotic alloys. The data pointed unequivocally to a dense cluster of defense contractors operating across the river in northern New Jersey. The investigation narrowed its focus to several specific manufacturing plants located in the towns of Paterson, Clifton, and Wayne. These facilities were known to be fabricating essential hardware for America's nascent intercontinental ballistic missile program, including the Atlas rocket. Official diplomatic files listed Konstantin Fedoseev as a 42-year-old graduate of Moscow State University with credentials in comparative literature. His dossier stated he joined the Cultural Ministry in 1952 before being assigned to the UN mission in New York in January 1957. His cover identity had been constructed with professional care, supported by a flawless paper trail. For his first 10 months in the U.S., his overt behavior had been impeccable, triggering no alarms within the FBI units responsible for monitoring the routine activities of Soviet diplomatic staff. Morrison mobilized a dedicated surveillance unit of 8 agents, scheduling them in rotating shifts to ensure 24-hour coverage. The objective was to track Fedoseev's every move without alerting the trained intelligence officer that his cover had been compromised. The operation commenced on a Monday morning in early December 1957. Agents positioned themselves discreetly around Fedoseev's apartment complex in Jackson Heights, waiting to see if the diplomat's reality matched the fiction of his official duties. What the team witnessed in that first week shattered Fedoseev's cover story and validated Frank Martinez's instincts with terrifying accuracy. The diplomat emerged from his building each day at exactly 6:15 a.m., dressed in a sharp business suit and clutching a leather briefcase. However, instead of walking toward the subway station for a commute to Manhattan, he proceeded to a private parking garage 3 blocks away. There, he kept a nondescript Ford sedan, a vehicle registered under a false name to a non-existent address in Brooklyn. He drove this vehicle across the George Washington Bridge, crossing into New Jersey. His route took him deep into the industrial heartland of Passaic County, where he would park the car and begin long, arduous walks through the gritty manufacturing districts. He spent hours on foot, circling the perimeters of defense contractor facilities. Sometimes he would loop around a single city block multiple times, pausing occasionally to tie his shoelaces at strategic vantage points that offered a direct line of sight into loading docks or employee parking lots. In just the first week, FBI teams logged Fedoseev conducting reconnaissance on 7 distinct facilities. These included 2 factories manufacturing titanium airframe parts for missiles and a precision machine shop specializing in gyroscope housings for guidance systems. The routes he traversed aligned perfectly with the wear patterns Martinez had decoded. The mileage estimates calculated by the Cobbler from the thinning leather soles matched the actual distances Fedoseev was marching during his clandestine surveillance operations. Morrison expanded the scope of the operation, authorizing photographic surveillance. The team began to catalog the faces of the people Fedoseev seemed to be watching, focusing on factory workers who gathered for smoke breaks outside the gates during shift changes. The breakthrough arrived on the 8th day of the operation. Agents captured clear photographs of Fedoseev executing a brush pass, a momentary, discreet exchange, with a man wearing work coveralls outside a diner near a sensitive facility in Clifton. The Bureau quickly identified the worker as Gary Patterson, a 51-year-old machinist. Patterson had been employed at the Clifton plant for 6 years and possessed a security clearance granting him access to technical blueprints and production timelines for the Atlas ICBM program. On paper, Patterson was a ghost. He had no history of political activism, no foreign connections, and had never traveled outside the U.S. borders. He lived a quiet, modest life that matched his income, showing none of the typical vulnerabilities that foreign recruiters exploit. Morrison ordered immediate, full-spectrum surveillance on Patterson while maintaining the net around Feetasive. Teams tracked the machinist to a small, solitary home in Patterson, where he had lived alone since his divorce 3 years prior. Technicians covertly entered Patterson's residence to install listening devices, but the audio feed revealed nothing suspicious. A discreet search of his household trash turned up only standard refuse: no codes, no spy gear, no photography equipment. The true nature of the relationship only clarified after 3 more weeks of relentless observation. The surveillance teams documented 4 more brief encounters between the diplomat and the machinist at various locations scattered across northern New Jersey. It became evident that Patterson was functioning as a passive collector. He wasn't stealing documents in bulk, he was gathering intelligence during his legitimate work hours. There were no envelopes of cash exchanging hands, and no signs of coercion or blackmail were visible. Patterson appeared to be a willing participant in the betrayal. The question that kept Morrison awake at night was why a seemingly loyal American citizen with a clean record would voluntarily hand over his nation's most guarded secrets to the Soviet Union. The answer lay in a tragedy buried in his past. Patterson's son had been killed in action during the Korean War in 1951. The father held the U.S. government responsible, blaming them for sending young men to die in what he viewed as a senseless conflict. The Soviets had identified this grief and weaponized it. The Federal Bureau of Investigation stood at a tactical crossroads regarding the Feetasive dossier. They faced the immediate imperative to plug the intelligence leak versus the strategic advantage of letting the operation run to map the full extent of the enemy network. Special Agent Morrison argued vehemently during high-level strategy sessions in Washington. He contended that arresting Patterson immediately would sever only one tentacle of the Hydra, leaving an unknown number of other operatives burrowed deep within the defense industry. The decision was ultimately adjudicated at the highest echelons of government, involving Director J. Edgar Hoover and chiefs from the CIA and Pentagon. The political atmosphere was electric. The recent Sputnik launch demanded a demonstration of American counterintelligence dominance. A strategy of controlled observation was adopted. The Bureau would cast a wider net, using aggressive surveillance to identify every node in the Soviet web before executing a synchronized strike designed to inflict maximum diplomatic and operational damage. Morrison's teams established static observation posts in rented apartments and commercial offices overlooking key New Jersey defense plants. These vantage points allowed them to monitor the handover zones without exposing agents on the street. The widened aperture of the investigation yielded results almost immediately. Photographic analysis confirmed that Feetasive was merely one gear in a larger machine. He was operating in tandem with at least 2 other intelligence officers, each running distinct collection tracks. Agents identified Mikhail Korolev, a translator at the UN, conducting parallel walking surveillance in Wayne and Totowa. He was targeting facilities producing electronic guidance components, utilizing the same tradecraft of parking remotely and blending in with business attire. A third operative, initially a ghost in the system, was tracked down through relentless detective work. Leonid Danilov posed as a graduate student at Columbia University, but his visa paperwork bore the subtle, telltale inconsistencies of KGB forgery rather than academic bureaucracy. Danilov's movements around defense sites in Patterson betrayed a level of professional training incompatible with his cover as a student. The Soviets had deployed a decentralized swarm, a network designed to survive even if one node was compromised. The investigation pivoted sharply in late January 1958. Surveillance teams tracked Feetasive breaking his established routine to meet a new contact. This target worked at a completely different facility than Patterson, expanding the scope of the breach significantly. The new asset was identified as Samuel Clark, a 37-year-old quality control inspector. He worked at a plant specializing in high-grade alloy castings for rocket engines. Unlike Patterson, Clark's motivation was not rooted in grief or ideology, but in simple, desperate greed. Financial audits revealed Clark was drowning in gambling debt, owing over $15,000 to illegal bookmakers. The Soviets had purchased his loyalty, exploiting his financial ruin to gain access to metallurgical secrets even more sensitive than production schedules. Clark's access to quality control data posed an existential threat. This information could allow Soviet engineers to reverse engineer American alloys and identify structural weaknesses in U.S. missiles, potentially accelerating their own weapons programs by years. The risk of allowing this flow of data to continue became untenable. Morrison received the green light to prepare the endgame. The goal was a simultaneous takedown to prevent any operative from destroying evidence or fleeing the country once the first domino fell. The date for the operation was fixed for February 14, 1958. However, nature intervened with a brutal ice storm that coated the New York metropolitan area in a dangerous glaze, forcing Morrison to delay the strike teams by 2 hours to ensure safe transit to their targets. Ignorant of the closing net, Konstantin Fedoseev adhered to his routine. He departed his apartment at 6:15 a.m. for the final time, drove across the George Washington Bridge, and parked his car near the Clifton facility to begin his morning reconnaissance walk. At precisely 9:30 a.m., the trap snapped shut. Over 40 FBI agents moved in unison across 2 states. Fedoseev was surrounded and detained on a sidewalk in Clifton, his walking tour permanently interrupted by federal badges. Simultaneously, arrest teams descended on Mikhail Korolev as he left his Manhattan residence. Leonid Danilov was apprehended on the campus of Columbia University. At the defense plants, Patterson and Clark were taken into custody at their respective workstations. The entire Soviet network, meticulously built over years, was dismantled in under 20 minutes. Search warrants executed at 6 locations yielded a treasure trove of evidence: encryption pads, microcameras for document copying, and detailed dossiers on U.S. defense infrastructure. The diplomatic fallout was immediate. The State Department expelled Fedoseev, Korolev, and Danilov within 72 hours, declaring them persona non grata. The Soviet Union issued furious denials, claiming persecution, but the physical evidence made their protests ring hollow. Moscow retaliated with the standard expulsion of American diplomats, but privately, the KGB reeled from the disaster. They had lost a critical window into U.S. strategic weapons development at the height of the arms race, all because of a failure in basic tradecraft. Patterson and Clark faced the prospect of the death penalty for espionage. To save their lives, both men accepted plea bargains, agreeing to provide full disclosures of their recruitment and activities. Patterson received 25 years, Clark was sentenced to 30. In public statements, the FBI attributed the case to a confidential source, deliberately obscuring Frank Martinez's role. This anonymity was a shield against Soviet retribution and a way to protect a valuable method of detection for future counterintelligence operations. Morrison met Martinez one last time in the quiet of the shoe repair shop. He presented the cobbler with a personal letter of gratitude from J. Edgar Hoover and a reward of $5,000, a sum that allowed Frank to modernize his business while remaining in the shadows. The success of the Fedoseev case inspired the Bureau to launch a covert program recruiting service professionals, tailors, barbers, and dry cleaners, to act as eyes and ears in diplomatic circles. This network operated in silence for decades, thwarting numerous foreign intelligence efforts. Konstantin Fedoseev returned to Moscow to face a career-ending inquiry. Soviet intelligence was forced to overhaul its operating procedures, issuing strict new protocols on physical appearance and clothing maintenance to avoid creating the kind of forensic trail that had betrayed them. Frank Martinez continued to fix shoes on Roosevelt Avenue until he retired in 1983. He never sought fame, never gave interviews, and carried the secret of his contribution to his grave. He passed away in 1997, his obituary omitting the fact that he had once outsmarted the KGB. After his death, his family found the letter from Hoover. It remains a quiet testament to a fundamental truth of national security, that the most sophisticated spy rings can be undone not by high-tech gadgets, but by the sharp eyes of a citizen who notices what everyone else ignores. The eroded leather of a few pairs of Italian shoes had inadvertently changed the course of the Cold War, proving that in the world of espionage, the devil truly is in the details.